you very much for joining us in this important event. I think we are here again in a year of uncertainty, and we as IOE wanted to prepare us better for what's coming next, and that's why we organized this digital conference. And first of all, I have to thank the very well-reputed participants that we have in the panel. We have WHO. We'll have a message for Mr. Dr. Tedros Adhanom, the Director General of the World Health Organization. We have Mr. Guy Ryder, the Director General of the ILO. We have Dr. Catherine O'Brien, the Director, Department of Immunization in WHO. We have Mr. Stephen Kampeter, which is the CEO of the Confederation of German Employers, the VDA, one of the most important members of IOE. We have Sharon Barrow, the Secretary General of the International Trade Union Confederation. Tunsi Medwawa, very known for us because it's our Vice President in IOE, but also the spokesperson of the employers in the ILO. We have Jerik Devel, the Vice President of Strategic Projects in the ADECO group, and very much involved in all the issues related to vaccination, testing. And we have Muriel Nasa Sidibe, founder and Chief Mission Officer, branch on a mission and research fellow in the Center for Business and Government in the Harvard Kennedy School. She's joining us from Kenya. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Scott Rutzland. He's the co-founder of an important initiative of our American member, USAID, which is called Business Partners to Convince, the Convince initiative, which has to do much on vaccination. So thank you all of you for joining us, and thank you to the audience, to all the participants from different areas of the world. We have simultaneous interpretation, English, Spanish, and French. I'm Roberto Suarez. I'm the Secretary General of the IOE. I should have said that before. We have to optimize our time. Before we start with the opening remarks also of our president, and I want also to thank him. I also want to remind you that you need to be, normal things that we all know now. You need to mute it. We'll have the chat function for questions and answers. And of course, we'll need to optimize our time to the maximum, but we'll be able to answer your questions on the chat function. Please use them. So Errol, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. Director General Guy Ryder of the International Labour Organization. Dear Guy, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, a warm welcome to this digital conference on COVID-19, what employers need to prepare for next. 1 year after the pandemic has become a global health emergency, is the crisis far from being over. The global COVID-19 death toll has reached 2.4 million, according to researchers at Johns Hopkins University. Meanwhile, infections have passed 110.3 million worldwide. Employers have made huge efforts in the last 12 months to adapt to the pandemic, to ensure that businesses survive and that the health and well-being of workers is protected. In these turbulent times, employers have been a trusted partner for governments and workers and became a key resource for information for their employees. The Edelman Trust Barometer 2021 even states that businesses has become the only trusted institution far ahead of governments, NGOs, and media. With trust comes even more responsibility. We must ensure that we, as employers, meet the expectations and hopes of stakeholders. The Business Convince initiative, which has been launched by the IOE member federation USCIB, builds on this credibility of business to promote preventive measures such as testing and vaccination at the workplace. There is still a huge amount of work ahead of us. Although we see with more and more preventive measures, testing regimes, and vaccination, the silver stripes on the horizon, COVID-19 will continue to deeply impact the way companies engage with customers, the way we organize work, and the way we socialize with each other. Viral variants are emerging with concerning characteristics around the world, which make exit strategies from lockdowns more difficult. Measures such as social distancing, hand hygiene, and masks will continue to play an important role in tackling the pandemic. As business and employer federations, we speak up vis-à-vis governments to make sure that COVID-19 strategies take into account the needs of the real economy, and we also, of course, support companies through capacity learning and peer-to-peer learning on issues such as how to implement testing regimes at the workplace and how to engage on the issue of vaccination. And there are more challenges ahead of us. The pandemic risks of broadening inequalities between richer and poorer countries through the difference in access to preventive tools. Of the 128 million vaccine doses administered so far, for instance, more than 3/4 of these vaccinations are just in 10 countries that account for 60% of global GDP. International collaboration is increasingly fragmented. Last month, the WHO issued a call to all countries to work together in solidarity and each in their best interests to ensure that within the first 100 days of the year, vaccination of health workers and older people was underway in all countries. However, it is not only about vaccination. In order to open up economies and enable cross-border mobility, the mutual recognition of testing results will be of crucial importance. There is a strong need for further increasing international cooperation. COVID-19 has highlighted the need for collective action and partnership. The fact that a vaccine was developed in 10 months instead of 10 years is because of this close cooperation between the private and the public sector. We need to build on this partnership approach coming out of the crisis. Although we focus in this digital conference on what employers need to prepare for next, we of course take a comprehensive view and looking at all actors. We are here to commit and show a sense of responsibility. IOE will provide pertinent guidance and advice to our companies to anticipate these challenges, and this exchange will be very useful for this purpose. Equally important, IOE will take further joint action with our business organizations and WHO, ILO, ITUC, and other stakeholders to provide answers on the effective preventive culture that we need to go back to the workplace premises. Thank you. Back to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Errol. I think that you raised many of the points that will be discussed. Just a reminder of the questions that we have asked the panelists, and they don't have to answer all of them because there are many questions much incertitude. One has to do with the kind of forecast that we could have for going back to the normal work premises. What is the prediction? The second one is related with what's the role of the international organizations like WHO, ILO, public institutions, but also employers and business organizations and trade unions, and we have here at Duke, how we can do things better in order to have this preventive culture on a safe return to the work premises. The third question, which is the most tricky one perhaps, is the role of testing and vaccination at the workplace. I mean, to what extent is there any capacity from the employer to impose or also to persuade? What are the legal consequences? What are the experiences we have so far? And there is other two questions. One has to do with mobility. I mean, we want also to have this balance between economic recovery and health. we also have to be very much aware of that mobility is needed. Mobility, not just within a country, but also cross-border, and how we can tackle that. And the final question is the middle and long-term scenario. Will social distance, masks, and other preventive measures will remain? What's your forecast? So those are the 5 questions. I'm not going to repeat all of them, but I will go just now to the message of Mr. Tedros. Monique, can you put that on the screen? Thank you.
Distinguished guests, dear colleagues and friends, the COVID-19 pandemic has shaken our world with profound implications for businesses and economies. With the development of safe and effective vaccines in record time, there is light at the end of the tunnel. These powerful tools will help to end the pandemic, but they're only a piece of the puzzle. It's important to emphasize that vaccines complement but do not replace basic public health measures like testing, contact tracing, physical distancing, masks, hand hygiene, and so on. And vaccines only work if we use them properly. That means we must distribute vaccines equitably around the world so that all countries can protect health workers, older people, and other vulnerable groups. The more the virus circulates, the more opportunities it has to mutate in ways that could render vaccines ineffective. We could end up back at square one. And the longer the pandemic drags on, the longer trade will be disrupted and the longer the recovery will take. As employers, you have a vital role to play in adding your voice to the chorus calling for vaccine equity and to a sustainable response and recovery that fosters safe working conditions and the physical and mental health of employees. Ultimately, vaccine equity is not just the right thing to do. It's the best way to control the pandemic, restore confidence, and reboot the global economy. Until we end the pandemic everywhere, we will not end it anywhere. I thank you.
I think that we have to thank Mr. Tedros. I mean, he was initially going to engage directly, but finally he had an unforeseen request. But I will liaise now with Guy Ryder. I mean, Guy, you know, in our daily work in ILO, we have different challenges linked to the to the activity of the ILO itself. But at the end of the day, and we are discussing how we can answer as constituents, together with workers and also with the governments in an effective response. Also during the ILC, the International Labour Conference. But how you can see us as constituents and also ILO working in the direction of a better, safe back to work. And I don't like to use the back to work because we have always, many of us have been working intensively during this period, but to the work premises. I mean, you can pick up the questions that you want to answer but we are more than willing to engage further also in the questions and answers part of this exchange. Thank you very much again, Guy, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Roberto, and thanks to the IOE for the invitation to participate in this extraordinarily opportune conversation. And I will try to address the questions that you put to us, and also perhaps to follow on from what our colleague Dr. Tedros has said. Some things that we all know, but which define the circumstances in which we find ourselves. 2020 was an extraordinary shock to global labour markets, businesses around the world. And I think we know the magnitude of what happened, the equivalent of 255 million jobs destroyed in the course of 2020. The question then is, how do we get out of this? And I think the first thing to say is, and Dr. Tedros said, there is light at the end of the tunnel thanks to the development of effective vaccines. How do we now embark upon the recovery process? And I think there's a number of things to keep in mind here. Firstly, and I think everybody's going to agree on this one, this is not the moment to indulge in trying to make overconfident forecasts. Anybody over the last year who was giving precise forecasts of where we're going to be in 6 months' time has probably learned that this was not a good idea. That continues to be the case. So that's not, I certainly won't indulge in the forecasting, which would be a guessing business. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking ahead. What we need to think about is what we need to do to make the recovery as early, as strong, I want to say as equitable as well, so that we get out of this quite appalling crisis that the world of work has fallen into. The first point, and I benefit here from speaking after Dr. Tedros, what happens in the world of work depends critically on public health policy and that equitable rollout of vaccines around the world. And I think, all of us subscribe to what Dr. Tedros has just said. And we have a problem here, because just as the international response to the economic and social impact of the crisis, that $12 trillion that was spent by governments around the world in 2020 was spent very unevenly. I mean, rich countries had a lot of money and very understandably spent it on keeping their businesses, their workers going. That means that we've had an extraordinarily uneven response in the economic and social terms. And if that is repeated in terms of vaccines, we will pay the price. So we do have to find a way of doing better, can I call it, on the political economy of vaccines? And that's not going to be easy. If I open the Financial Times every day, I see the league tables saying, well, what percentage of the population have different governments got vaccinated? The league table of success is what people are doing at home, not what they're doing in contributing to COVAX. And businesses, all of us, have to get involved in trying to find a better way forward than that. The second point is, and this is a question more than anything else, is we know there is permanent damage in certain parts of our economies. Certain enterprises haven't made it despite the efforts made. I think the question many are asking is, well, how different are global labor markets and businesses going to look when we come out of this crisis as compared to when we went in? Is it simply a case of getting back to where we were, or is it going to something different? And I think in discussions like this, everybody says, we have to go somewhere different, somewhere better. It's a sort of a yes, we can moment. We're not so good at saying what that better normal actually looks like and how we do it. So there's a lot of issues around what's going to be different in the future. Generalized remote working, teleworking, I don't know, restructured supply chains, etc. But I think we do need, and in the ILO, as you know, Roberto, we're giving some attention to this. We are trying to work out where we want to go, not simply to be pushed by circumstances, what we're obliged to do while we're coexisting with the virus, but where we want to go. So there's a lot of issues out there. And by the way, I think there are some quite critical issues coming up around international economic circumstances. We know that debt levels have gone up very strongly for good reasons, but we know there's a great deal of debt stress, particularly in developing and emerging countries. If we see a surge in inflation and interest rates, that could have quite devastating impacts on a recovery process, for which otherwise people might think there are very good prospects for a roaring 20s phenomenon. Well, it's all very uncertain, as you've said. And then, if this sounds rather superstructural, I think we have to come down to the everyday nitty-gritty, the issues that businesses are going to be having to deal with in the weeks and months ahead. And you've put your finger on a couple of them. There's a lot of discussion, isn't there, about whether vaccination should be made mandatory or encouraged in some way. I think we are aware of the WHO position on that, but Dr. O'Brien will certainly bring us up to date on that. I think we've got some tough questions ahead of us because international labour standards don't actually say very much about the issue of mandatory vaccines. But there will be companies, no doubt, that will want to secure the wide rollout of vaccines for their own workforces. And when it comes to international businesses, we have this element of cross-border mobility to think about, which by definition requires a higher level of international cooperation than what we've seen before. A lot there, and I could go on, but perhaps the last point I want to make is, Roberto, and congratulations for it. When you have the WHO on screen, I hope the ILO, when you have business here, when you have organized labor here, when you have the academic community and civil society, you've got the right people. You've got the right people to construct the way forward from here. And it has to be that inclusive, participatory process that can take us forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. And we know how busy you are. And the fact that you're also remaining here with us with all this discussion already is a sign. It's a sign of your engagement with us in this discussion, as well as the engagement of WHO. And we have with us Catherine O'Brien. I already introduced her. Perhaps you came a little bit later because you have other important duties, I assume. I suppose that you are very much aware of the questions that we raised to you, which are not easy questions and are linked to a huge incertitude period. What kind of insight you can provide us in terms of prediction, in terms of policies that we have to apply as company, in terms of partnership, also in terms of the middle and long-term perspective from a preventive culture. Catherine, again, thank you for joining. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm so pleased to be with all of you. And apologies that I was a little bit late joining the meeting, but I'm glad we're all together now. A couple of things that I wanted to raise in the short time that I have for some comments and to address some of the questions. First of all, I do want to give a picture of where we are right now with vaccines. So it's been almost 80 days since the first country began a rollout program of vaccines. That was the UK. And 60 days since the European Union started to roll out their vaccines. Over 200 million doses of vaccine have been administered. However, 80% of these doses are being given in only 10 countries. We are never going to get out of this if this continues. I just want to repeat that. Many of the people on this call may live in those 10 countries and feel pretty good that they have broad access to vaccines. This is not going to end for any country, even those that are vaccinating and intending to vaccinate very widely their populations, if we do not do a better job of equitably distributing those vaccines. And that's not on a moral argument, that's on a scientific, epidemiologic, and economic argument. What you're seeing right now, we're seeing variants emerge. Those variants are going to continue, and they are going to put pressure on every country that is not using and using vaccines as long as transmission is continuing in wide parts of the world. The only way that we're getting out of this is if we are all getting out of it together. So that's my main message here. And so we have to see a change in the way that vaccines are being distributed and the behavior of countries that have bilateral deals. Many countries are continuing to pursue bilateral deals, which is actually harming the equitable distribution of a limited supply of vaccines that we have in the world right now. That supply is constrained, and there is not an endlessly elastic supply at this point. So we really have to focus our attention on what we expect countries to be doing to protect the mechanisms we have for global allocation of vaccines. The second thing I want to say is that we have started the global allocation of vaccines. Yesterday, Ghana was the first country to receive vaccines through the COVAX facility. We will see a shipment to Cote d'Ivoire in the coming days, and then there will be next week a much broader rollout in the days and these very early weeks to come. By the end of March, we expect there to be a very broad number of countries that up till now have had zero access to vaccines, and the initiation of programs in all countries to at least begin the process of immunizing the highest priority groups, which are the health workers. They do support, they are critical for maintaining the health infrastructure in all countries around the world. and older adults. And the reason older adults are the priority is because they have the highest risk of severe disease and death. And that is really the reason why we're in the situation we're in, is the severity of the disease. If this was a mild disease that was self-limited, that went away after 2 days of an upper respiratory illness, we would not be instituting all of the measures that have collapsed economies, restricted our social engagement, and really upended our communities and our way of life. So please remember why the priorities are what they are for this constrained amount of supply that we have around the world at this moment in time, while manufacturing is increasing and we can see our way towards broader manufacturing capacity in 2022 and beyond. We have 3 outstanding issues for which there are no answers at this point. Will we need booster doses? In other words, is getting immunized the end of it? Or are we actually going to be in a situation like we have with flu vaccine or other vaccines where booster doses are needed, either because of a limited duration of immunity or because of strain changes, that the vaccine that we have against existing strains is not adequately effective for strains that are emerging? We also have the third question, which is, at the moment, we don't have the evidence to underpin a policy around whether people under 16 or 18 years of age should be vaccinated. So there is a broad group of people for whom we cannot recommend vaccination at this time, not because we know it doesn't work or not because we know it is harmful in any way. We simply are in absence of information. So those are dimensions of the vaccine program that are yet to come. So that's sort of the situation in terms of the trends of vaccination right now. Very inequitable access to vaccine at this point, in large part because of the tremendous number of bilateral deals that countries have been pursuing, which is not helping the COVAX facility in terms of its ability to distribute vaccines in a fair and equitable way. So will vaccines get us out of this? Again, I want to emphasize, vaccines are not a silver bullet or a magic bullet in this. For everybody who's vaccinated, at this point in time, all other measures need to continue. Masking, hand washing, distancing, not aggregating in large groups. And the reason for that is we don't have the information yet about whether these vaccines prevent infection. We have the information about whether they prevent you getting ill, preventing disease. But I think everybody knows that you can be infected and have either no symptoms or extremely mild symptoms, and you are infectious. So without the information about the degree to which the vaccines actually prevent acquisition of infection, and the likelihood of, if you have the infection, transmitting it to somebody else, even if you're vaccinated, you individually may be protected against disease, but you may still pose a threat to other people. So we don't have that information yet. And as a result, the vaccines don't mean that you can take off your mask, start throwing large parties and things like that, or in the workplace, being in areas or ways of working that are not protected. I want to also discuss sort of the, what we expect in terms of cross-border mobility, vaccine hesitancy, and the issue of mandatory vaccination policies. Again, emphasizing there's only one vaccine that has a travel requirement, an international travel requirement, and that's the yellow fever vaccine for people who are traveling to or from yellow fever endemic areas. At this point, the conditions for vaccination, the conditions around the vaccine, the availability of the vaccine, and policies that would make a difference are not in place for COVID vaccine to be considered as a vaccine required by international health regulations. So there is no requirement through IHR for use of the vaccine for international travel. And again, I'll just reinforce what I just said. Part of this is because we don't understand, we don't know whether or not the vaccines would protect against infection or transmission. There are significant issues as a result of this around what workplaces should be doing. As a general policy, as a general approach, we don't recommend mandatory vaccination. in countries, communities, or businesses. And the reason for that is, although many countries do have legislation of some sort for the purpose of childhood vaccination for school entry or school attendance, and there has been a mixed experience of whether or not such legislation and requirements is beneficial in securing the high coverage of vaccines and the protection of all children against infectious diseases. In some settings, it has probably been helpful. In other settings, it's been probably harmful about the confidence of families and communities in the vaccination program. And there can be an unintended negative effect, which obviously any mandates are not intended for. The evidence really shows what is much better is to provide access to vaccines, provide wide, easy, simple to provide high quality access. And when those services are valued by communities and there is confidence in the vaccines, then we're much more successful at assuring that people who should be vaccinated need to be vaccinated. There may be a very limited set of circumstances, for instance, some specific healthcare settings where the safety of the patients or the safety of the clients is dependent on the protection of workers against COVID through vaccination, but these would be very limited circumstances. So we don't see that there will be policies that would be coming, recommended policies from WHO to advise in a positive way for mandates on vaccines. And then my final point is really on this issue of the sort of role of workplaces. And I think there are a number of ways in which workplaces are extremely important in this rollout. The rollout of vaccines is the largest vaccine rollout ever in history. And so every component of our societies, including employers and workplaces, have a role to play. And part of this is around information sharing, and part of it is around facilitation of programs. And we know, especially for influenza vaccine, that many workplaces are the place where people get their vaccination. It's a place of ease. It's a place of where people are comfortable, and it facilitates access to vaccination. So from a programmatic perspective, as supply increases and as governments in all countries contemplate and start to action how they will provide vaccines to people, employment workplaces are an important location and site where some of this can happen. And what is certainly true is they are critical for information sharing of accurate, valid, credible information about what the program is in the country, who will be prioritized first. And what we've seen across many countries that are rolling out vaccine is there is high acceptance of the prioritization in countries when it is communicated in a clear way and in a very transparent way about what the underlying characteristics are for why the prioritization is what it is, with most emphasis on health workers at high or very high risk of transmission and those most at risk of severe disease or death. And again, we've seen that highly accepted in the vast majority of countries. And then my final point is just around the role of vaccines in stimulating the global economic recovery. We have all seen the analysis about the economic losses to high-income countries, comparing an approach where vaccines are deployed for a limited number of countries, compared with deploying those same vaccines across a much broader number of countries at about a 50% coverage level, and the trillions of dollars that are lost if there is an inequitable distribution of those vaccines. So this is a powerful economic argument, not just a moral or even an epidemiologic argument, if neither of those are influential in people's thinking. And so the vaccines, I think, are playing and will play a very important part in the recovery, but they are not a singular solution to this pandemic. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think you have provided very, very useful insights, but not insights. I mean, areas of action also for us as employers. There will come some questions, perhaps how can we work together for the future, but I will leave that to the end. And I want now to give the floor to Stefan. Thank you again, Stefan. It's very important for us to have you here. Okay, it's not just because it's the BDA, our main employer, it's because also the experience you can bring, also in an organization which is also leading some of the debate, you know, in Germany, but I would say in Europe. So please, the floor is yours. We are.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invitation and the possibility of sharing views and getting information from global partners. Dear friends, colleagues, and listeners, for business people, they can deal with risk. They can count it, and what they hate is uncertainty, because uncertainty is something which business people cannot calculate. And COVID is the biggest uncertainty we have for decades. And so this is why businesses are so keen on finding easy, single silver bullet solution we don't have at the moment. But we're very aware that collaboration, multilateralism, and cooperation between different stakeholders is key to solve the challenge to get from uncertainty into risk and into a stable situation. I'm giving you a German perspective, probably not solid or valid for everybody, but probably similar in some of the European countries. And so I'd like to take some of your questions. And the first important issue is how we are engaged in getting people a safe return to work. And actually, this is something where we can contribute. Leaving people at home is not a lasting answer to the challenge, and the social partners and the entrepreneurs they know the business, the processes, they have the experience in the company, how to practice, and we have invested in the last 12 months much to get things more safe in the workplace, and we can at the same time help to strengthen the acceptance of the protective measures in the population by communicating into our employed people how necessary safe behavior is. Our working assumption is that COVID will stay. We don't listen to those for radical answers among the umbrella no COVID. So we know that many of our measures will last longer than only for weeks or months. Our companies demand a comprehensive testing and vaccination strategy from the policy deciders. We have a very controversial debate within business community on prioritization. We accept as German business people the prioritization on elderly and very handicapped persons, and we are offering our infrastructure for vaccination when it's necessary, because we see a shift from now vaccines are limited, and then when the supply shift is there, the vaccination possibilities are limited. So we are make an offer to our government that we can play an important role in raising vaccination process. We are bridging between our companies and the policy decision makers. Another very important point is that we believe that global value chains must kept open during the pandemic. To be very outspoken, I believe that we have a vaccine now is a success of free enterprise, the will of taking risks, of a private-public partnership, and a result of international exchange. And so, if we're now limiting for reasons that the free movement of goods and people for more than necessary, actually open borders and exchange of people are necessary and have been the basic foundation of the existence of a vaccine. And free and liberal societies cannot jail people for longer than only a few times. We are, in this context, I want to highlight the OECD initiative for safer and international mobility during the pandemic, which some of our entrepreneurs activities are participating and doing that. I'd like to highlight that we have to put some effort beside, no, I'd like to add something on open borders. Europe is an exporter on vaccines, and there are not many exporters on vaccines. If I look, for example, on the USA, they don't export any vaccine. So open borders are clearly an answer to what Catherine has said. A broader distribution of the vaccine activities. If we believe as an international community that this is something only to keep it nationalized, that would be a misunderstanding. If you look to the messages sent from the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she has a global approach, and it's very complicated to balance between national and European interests and distribution, but open borders are the key for a broader distribution, and don't underestimate this. And my last point, looking on the time, is looking on the future post-COVID strategy. The world will be different after COVID. And I would to highlight one point, that is the effect of the Digi issue. Everybody's working from home. We have completely reorganized our system, how to get daily goods. So I don't believe that everything will be after COVID than it was before COVID. We have made 10 to 15 years a change within 10 to 15 months. And this actually is a big challenge for the workforce. Talents needed before COVID, will they be the talents needed after COVID? And actually, I think that my proposal I made to Garuda earlier, that the ILO has to be a competence center on reskilling, upskilling, lifelong learning, and human and social skills, as well as on the vocational training, is even more urgent. Seeing the skill shift needs, and I very much stress out that the ILO Centenary Declaration is saying something very positive on that. And we have not only look on vaccines and on opening strategies, we have to focus now on post-COVID strategies. And I think the workforce skill issue is one of the crucial. If these new skills are not available, unemployment is the reaction. And this would be a second failure after probably not everything is going fine on the path out of COVID. This will have to be a success story. So look on skillment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think that also the reference that you made to global supply chains is quite pertinent in these days. And precisely, Sharon, we have been dealing with the challenges that we have in front of us, not just at local level, but also from a global perspective in global supply chains. We have been trying to act together. Sharon, we need to work with you, but we need also to hear you and how we can do also better also for what's coming.
Thank you, Roberto. And I agree with Guy that in fact, if all the actors are together, then it's our responsibility to find the pathway, just as critical moments for the world, workers, employers and governments have done so in the past, particularly in regard to, of course, the ILO and its tripartite history and culture. But I think the way we see this is in layers. So first of all, workplaces, getting workers back to work, it's as important for us as it is for business. But we also know they have to be safe workplaces if people are going to trust them. So vaccines, yes, and I'm not going to add to what people said about the scourge of vaccine nationalism. I think it's actually indicative of why our world is failing. And but what I will say is that I absolutely agree with Catherine that it's a big part of the solution, but we don't know if and when it will be the whole solution. So we need to bolster that with testing. We've been slightly appalled that while PCR testing has its place, of course, in terms of medical record and tracking and tracing, antigen testing, cheap, reliable, Germany, congratulations, handing them out free. You know if someone's got the virus and is potentially contagious right now, within 15 minutes. And provided we have the social protection sick leave, in guarantees around that, people will trust that. So if we really want to get people back to work, it's broader than just vaccines. And I know we share a common ambition around that and the critical role of occupational health and safety as a responsibility, but also as indeed a security for workers and for employers in terms of risk and liability. There's a huge sectoral risk. Not everything is equal in terms of back to work. And I thought, guys, caution about projections was right. We see these aggregate projections, people are confident. In fact, we see the unemployment projections that all try to tell good news stories. The amount of people who've given up looking for work, the gender inequality in those who are actively participating in the labour market, the devastation of a lack of proper social protection. And when the furlough schemes, the job guarantees and wage guarantees are increasingly withdrawn, we will see more of that. But it's also true that demand won't come back in just, a solid framework. And Roberto and I talk about this quite a lot. The supply chain model has to change. We have to build confidence in what inevitably with technology and demand will be a different set of frameworks and investment in supply chains. And we can't back away from the fact that this model was based too often on dehumanizing exploitation to actually maximize profits. And that has to shift with mandated due diligence, identifying risk, putting in place the grievance procedures. And we are better off doing that together. Even as we call for mandated due diligence, we want to work with employers to see that we get best practice. And of course, I would be wrong of me to not raise the fact that we have a broken labour market. There's this huge emphasis on, the digital economy. Yes, it is part of today and part of our future, but it also carries risks, and most of these jobs are informal. Even if you look at corporations that have morphed to telework or remote work, only 18% or thereabouts, with a maximum potential if we had connectivity for around 30%. And then they raise all sorts of issues around gender, childcare, mental health, occupational health and safety responsibility for home offices generally. And I know we are grasping with that set of issues just as you are, and what does the future look like? But in a broken labour market where 60% of our workforce and many of these workers, as well as traditional informal workers, have no rule of law, no rights, no social protection, we need to fix that. We absolutely need to fix that, and we can do that together. The 40% are also increasingly indeed in more secure formal work, but increasingly insecure. And again, for business and for workers, if we're going to invest in skilling and upskilling and lifelong learning, and we must be inclusive, we must rebuild the labour market, and indeed it must be indeed meeting the test of all workers. We cannot indeed, as others have said, recreate the past, or the level of trust and despair will be broken. And you're right, Roberto, about the role of business and unions in this current environment. But we cannot pretend that that trust will continue if there are no jobs, if they're not decent jobs. And so what I would say to you is that we are very focused, even as we live with the continuing impact of the vaccine and trying to look at a future of work that is safe and just. We need governments to step up nationally and internationally with the dialogue with employers and workers that makes plans for recovery and resilience absolutely understood and trusted. Of course, for workers, that's the call for a new social contract, and we together will rely very heavily on a range of issues nationally, but also internationally, the implementation of the Centenary Declaration, which has in fact the role of work, the role of employment in both the public and private sector. It looks at the areas of care that have been underfunded in the public sector arena, education, childcare, health, aged care, all of those things that actually make it possible for, the double burden of care for women to be relieved and to drive productivity by getting women back into the workplace. But it also says all workers, irrespective of employment arrangements, must have a floor of rights and protections. Fundamental rights, occupational health and safety, and I hope you'll join us in making that a fundamental right through the ILO, so important for both of us. And of course, an adequate minimum wage, evidence-based, on which people can live with dignity, and control over working hours, so important as we do see an increase in the digital world amongst other areas. But we say that's really critical, but it's got to be in the context of jobs, jobs and jobs, climate-friendly jobs. So sustainable enterprises, the more we put in to transforming sectors, the more jobs there'll be. And of course, it's got to be around those critical issues of rights and social protection and inclusion. So inequality is income, yes, but it's also gender and race. And I know diversity is a big issue for the business community, as it is for us. So we have a lot to work on. Let's just avoid the hype. Let's not actually look at the projections that say this is the future in the interests of one sector of business and investors' interest, but let's seriously work on the solutions, including global solidarity. We can see debt relief. We've called for it. We can see it. We can see the SDGs conditional on that debt relief, on increasing ODA to things like social protection, when only 0.4% of ODA goes to social protection. That's just nonsensical. And of course, when it looks to sharing technology for indeed a climate-friendly net zero future, if we look at it, take the vaccine nationalism piece and overlay it with energy, with mass transit, with manufacturing and industry policy, we've got to do better. So global solidarity on a social and an economic and indeed an environmental front will get us to a more just and inclusive development model, but will take all of us.
I take thank you very much, Sharon, the last point of global solidarity, because when we refer also, not just back to the work, but also I think, Catherine, you referred to that, to the equal distribution or global distribution of, in this case, vaccines. There is a developing economic dynamic, which I want to raise as a point from, perhaps, if you wish, Tunsi and his intervention, his contribution. And as I said at the very beginning, his role here is not just as a vice president of IOE or the employer spokesperson in the ILO, but also as a very reputed member in the South African business community. So, Tunsi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. But I think just to try and help you, because I'm also one of the hosts. I mean, this is our event, and I'm trying to manage time for you. How much time have I got? Because we started a bit late, and I want to make sure you've got time for all our guests. So how much time? You have your 5 minutes.
Don't worry, you have your 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. Okay, so I want to make sure that we are all good. All right, because I must leave also at 4 o'clock. I have another webinar. I must apologize that I am running. So I need 4 o'clock my time, which is 3 o'clock your time. Now, thank you very much. Again, good afternoon to all the colleagues. I'm going to try and not repeat a lot of the things that have been said, because, you know, one of the things I think that is very important to note, especially with the introductions that you asked us to make, Roberto, is that we all don't know what lies ahead. But what we do know is the experiences we all have from our corners. We all have experiences, we've seen how things are working, and we see how we continue to respond to things. And I think for me, what was very, very telling was a combination of what Dr. Tedros said earlier on and what Dr. O'Brien said. Dr. Tedros talked about if we don't treat everybody everywhere, we're not going to get anywhere. I think those are sort of the words he used. And then Dr. O'Brien talked about 80% in only 10 countries are being dealt with, which then tells us we have challenges. So for me, what I need to leave as a very provocative statement is, should we not be careful about how we put all our eggs in one basket? Because it's one thing to be hopeful and have wishful thinking that the vaccines are going to be part of the silver bullet. As we've heard from Dr. O'Brien, they're also not a silver bullet, but they could be a way towards the silver bullet, because we can talk about it helping from an acquisition point of view, but not necessarily helping in an infection point of view, because we don't have the evidence. So for me, is should we not be encouraging everybody at the same time to be working on other preventative measures as well, so that the poor countries who cannot have access as quickly as they want and who may never get to where they need to get to are also also able to respond. And this for me would be one of the lessons we must learn from the past, where we also understand that different circumstances require different solutions for different people all over the world. I think that's the first point I wanted to make. From a South African point of view, you will know, Roberto, I'm always very critical of my government, or any government for that matter that does not deliver, but particularly mine because it's my government, it's my country. In terms of the COVID management, South Africa has had varying levels of dealing with this, but overall there's agreement that it's been well managed in terms of how we respond and what have you. They've failed in two areas though. The one area the South African government has failed is managing, I think, to spread the word all over the world, because as South Africans, we are very upset that our government is failing to say, even if this other strain has come from South Africa, whatever it was, we don't like the fact that it looks like a pointing of fingers. First of all, we got the COVID from somewhere else, but it doesn't really matter now, does it? The fact of the matter is we all have COVID. So when you now say the new strain is a South African strain, it gives the impression that South Africa is worse off than everywhere else. And yet South Africa is a lot better than most parts of the world, but it is the worst in Africa. In Africa, we're certainly the worst because we're the most industrialized. So it doesn't really matter. The fact that South Africa is transparent and has statistics to share with the whole world must also not be used against South Africa to punish South Africa. And the government is failing to carry out this message that says, actually, we're doing a good job and we're doing okay. We're not the worst, we're not the best, but we have people who are much worse than us, and that's not the point. We should not be focusing on that. The second one is that there was a budget vote yesterday in South Africa where the Minister of Finance announced a budget that fails to take into cognizance the economic aspects of responding to the COVID, that also fails to take to cognizance the unemployment rate in South Africa. COSATU had a big statement yesterday that actually, the emphasis on a budget deficit has failed to capture the challenges we have, the crisis we have of unemployment in this country that has been exacerbated by the COVID. So I wanted to cover just that part first, Roberto, and then, because I don't have time, cover some of the questions you've asked, one of them relating to the incertitude that we have. So for me, employers can play a key role in preventing and slowing the spread of COVID. We've had this from Stefan, we've had it from other colleagues as well. We had it from Errol, our president. Employers' coordination with health officials at all levels to obtain timely and accurate information to inform appropriate responses is absolutely key. Employers need to consider how best to decrease the spread of the virus and lower the impact in workplaces, but guidance is key. Guidance to prevent and reduce transmission amongst employees, 2, maintain healthy business operations, and 3, maintain a healthy work environment. That's absolutely critical. Moreover, while keeping the workforce working remotely, guidance needs to extend health and safety measures at home and constitutes an important element to keep the workforce safe, healthy, and productive. And guidance on the steps employers are taking to manage the risk of contagion in the workplace will also contribute, having a workforce that feels safe and when returning to the workplaces. Now, the next point is what role testing and vaccination campaigns should be playing in the workplaces. The right approach for each organization has to be carefully assessed. I think for me, even for the IOE, one of the things we've said is that, for example, we are highly elated and very excited that we're going to have Scott, Professor Ratzan, speaking to us later on about Convince and us working with Convince. But we also need to be clear that as the IOE, we have 159 members in 150 countries. We will work with Convince, but we will work with everybody. We'll work with other. People must know that we must cater for everyone. So the IOE needs to create some kind of a platform where we will work with everyone. We'll work from somebody from the DRC, we'll work with people from South Africa, we'll work with Russia, we'll work with China, we'll work with India, we'll work with everybody. And even in that, I must also mention South Africa, by the way, was going to work on some form of vaccine that failed. I'm sure some people have heard this, that was found not to be appropriate and it had to be discarded at the last minute. We need to educate our people about these too, because as soon as they hear information about that, they think, oh my God, all vaccines are bad, you know, just because that one was bad. And then we shifted to another one. But at the same time, we need to be open-minded that there are other preventative measures that we must also have. Part of this, we cannot have a mandatory situation. We must also be able to say, vaccines are one way, but you know what? For you, you might have other preventative measures that might work better for you in your environment. We must have an open mind to those as well and not be rigid and impose one way as if it fits everybody. And in terms of the consultations, they need to be on a regular basis, Roberto, on the measures to be taken with works councils, the health and safety committees, with trade unions, as the people who work with workers all the time, the workers themselves through direct participations, and to increase support for an observation of the measures that are needed that we take from time to time. One of the points I want to mention last, because my 5 minutes now is almost gone, is that as the chair of Productivity South Africa, here we found another, and we are the secretariat, remember, for PAPA, for the Pan-African Productivity Association. We found huge challenges because of not enough information going through to even our employers, who are refusing to allow Productivity South Africa to come into workplaces to help them with business continuity, to intervene and make sure that workers are not retrenched and make sure that workers we've got operational efficiency, because people don't understand how this thing works and how it will get them to be infected and how they can prevent it the best way. So we as employer organizations need to make sure that we go right to the ground, make sure everybody understands, because if you're going to be stopped from helping people so that they can keep people in jobs, you can't have a situation where you're mindful about health, but you're not mindful about economic preservation, because it's not sustainable. You can have all the health you like, quite frankly. And some people, it's a big privilege to talk about health in some parts of the world I live in. If you can't keep me in a job, if you can't keep paying me a salary, if you can't keep me dignified, you can talk about washing hands, you can talk about distancing, you can talk about all these lovely things we talk about. But if you must be able to provide bread for your kids on that night and you can't because you are trying to put up the health aspect at the risk of dropping the economic one, there's a problem. So we must be alive to the realities of all the parts of the world that we come from. I'm going to stop there, Roberto. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You have been very comprehensive and very detailed. I just have a kind reminder from the interpreters, and it's very, very kind to speak a little bit slowly, even if we don't have much time.
That's me. I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. I'm just telling it to the coming ones. And I have, we have now a company perspective, Eric. I think your company, Adecco, has been very active, engaged with us, but also especially in this topic. And going now more on earth, and Tunsi referred to timely, accurate information, which is key, but also we have to digest this information and make it understandable. What's your approach? I know not just related to vaccination or testing, also in the overall approach in terms of preventive culture at the workplace.
Thank you. 15 minutes before the call, I received a mail from Mexico announcing me the death of a colleague. And every day I have to support countries all over the world that face people sick or more. So I think it's very important that we have this webinar today, because behind that, it's action. And, I think that we have to be very careful. We are at a dangerous moment because, in fact, we enter in a COVID era. What do I mean by that? I mean that, of course, people speak from vaccination, testing, and it's more and more organized in some countries. But it doesn't cover the young people, or few of them, and the workers are young. So here we can be very facing a big danger not to communicate enough to them. It's a very important topic. The basic protective measure doesn't include vaccination. We have to continue to communicate, but probably differently. You know, each time I had to deal with building a factory in the world that was facing a lot of cases, each time I was asking them to just verify the process, it didn't work. What worked? A call, a training, something that was speaking to the ears of the people. And here it's the message to the WHO. It's the moment to recreate nice video as you did 1 year ago, but probably with a little bit more fun, something that will attract our young people to make sure that they really understand that they are not protected at all for a long time. The second point is that we heard at the beginning that, yes, people trust their employer. But, you know, if they trust us, it's also because we can say sometimes that we don't know. And I think we have to be clear on that. It's also because we can give some hope. And I think we should say that. And my friend Stefan from Germany can probably say that. Yes, the business is coming back. Yes, the staffing industry is regrowing. And that's a good news. And it gives hope. But be careful, a new wave is coming. The psychological effect of the crisis is now coming. You know, the hybrid mode, we enter an hybrid mode with people working from home and coming back to the office time to time. You know, it generates well-being issues. Our managers are not trained, and we have to work on that. We have to train our manager to be manager at distance, and it's not easy. You know, we see the gender inequality regrowing again in 2020, 2021, thanks to the fact that we don't protect the private life of people enough. And, you know, for example, on this topic, I had really to put and to ask my CEO to be very clear with every manager in the world. We should protect the life of people working from home. But another topic is the digital gap, because, you know, only 30% in some country of people are working in, you know, white collar jobs. The other are in blue collar. And here, what we face is a digital gap. And also the fact that we don't look enough to the capacity to propose them remote work, or at least part of their time as a remote worker. You know, when you are a welder, of course, when you are a welder, you have to work in the factory. But when you train yourself, most of the training can be done remote. So let's be careful of, because it's not only to protect them, of course, during this moment it will protect, but it's also a way to prepare the future. We have to make sure that everybody doesn't say, oh, I don't want to be anymore a welder. I want to be in an office because I will be able to protect myself. So let's be careful with that. And I just will want to finish with the collaboration. You know, in the darkest moment in March last year, in the staffing industry, we decided with our two main competitors to collaborate and to redact a document for our clients and to work together. You know, it was the first time in the history of these three big companies we're working together. And it's a message to ILO. We are ready to collaborate. We are ready to share. Just ask us, and we will be here.
Thank you so much, Eric. Also to stick to the time. And very interesting, not very interesting, very provoking, I would say, message based also on facts and stories, which are relevant for us. Miriam, you come here not just as a researcher, your researcher hat also, but also, and you told it to us before we started the meeting, as a woman in a developing economy, because you're Kenya based. But there is much to say also in terms of how we can also put our mind together, as Eric was saying, to work in an efficient manner and letting aside our differences in terms of, you know, bringing back a healthy environment also at the workplace. So any insights from your side would be much appreciated. Thank you again for your time.
No, thank you very much, Suarez. I think Derek or alluded to a lot of the points that I wanted to make, and I think it is can you hear me properly? Just wanted to double check. Okay, great.
Perfectly.
I mean, no, I think he alluded to a lot of points that I wanted to make. Indeed, I'm based in Kenya. I have spent 15 years in a big multinational, Unilever, and whilst being in sabbatical at Harvard researching, I've decided to set up my own B Corp, social enterprise that's about, accelerating health and well-being for companies and brands. And, it really got me to rethink the value of work and how you've been operating over the last couple of years. And it is true that I'm very lucky that I'm, one of those people that could work from an office and can afford to be able to sit in front of a computer. But, what I also realize around me is obviously, what COVID has done in terms of being an equalizer and in terms of, really putting at the forefront the inequality that exists between women and men, and the role that still exists in a lot of our countries in terms of how, women are obviously supposed to be taking care of children and the way in which that responsibility very much lies, and there's one of them behind me, but how that responsibility lies very much on women still. And what does that mean in terms of like going back to employment? I actually don't believe that work is ever going to come back the way it was. And I don't think it should, for many of the women's and many of the men's out there that are going to get back to work. And I think, if you are an employer and you're thinking about how, your employees are going to go back to work, there is a certain element today around, obviously mental resilience. There is something about the kind of support system that's required that's been removed from a lot of people because the older parents, the older generation that could have been there to support the younger kids are no longer available. Anyway, so I mean, I did want to start with that because I think there is something about society and the way society has been built over the last couple of months in which, the way in which we are going to engage men, women, societies are going to be at the forefront of some of these conversations that we need to have. During this COVID-19, I was based in Kenya and I set up the National Business Compact, which is a collaboration that has over 40 different organizations thinking about what you could do, during COVID-19. And it has social businesses, NGOs, communication companies, and really thinking about how you could pull together what I call compassionate capitalism as a response to COVID-19, to try to really communicate, preventative measures of hand washing, of wearing masks, of physical distancing within the informal settings, not just within offices, because actually the people that were in offices are all back at home working from home. It is in the informal settings that you really need to think about where that's going. And this is where the wave of the communication needed to take place. And I thought, well, if I'm brands on a mission and my role is to really try to drive some sort of a branded approach around COVID-19 prevention, it's about, obviously trying to drive the norms of practicing some of these preventative behaviors, making the behaviors much more observable, trying to limit some of the excuses that people have for not practicing those behaviors and communicating expectations in line with where we are. And I thought, there's a lot of learnings that exist in the private sector and in marketing in a way that you could actually build that into how these behaviors are actually picked up. So we set up the National Business Compact and we started thinking about how do we make sure that each one of those social businesses, NGOs, delivery mechanisms create a very different informal ways in which those behaviors are actually packed up. And to be honest, it's worked very well. And if you look at how Kenya has actually tackled the COVID-19 crisis, it's something that we needed to really have, because to be able to get those behaviors in place, it shouldn't be only responsible to the health communities. That is not the health communities' role only. It is actually the role of more companies and more brands around the table. And so what we did here, which I think worked extremely well, was to put together all those companies and and put a rich tapestry of like players from competing global, local soap manufacturers and hygiene brands, communication organizations, retail companies, community organizations, business networks, non-profits, digital organizations, funders, and governing ministries. And I think together, collectively, these entities are brought to the table a depth of knowledge and breadth of experience and an ability to leverage existing networks that have led to real to a lot of successful initiatives in a relatively short times. So if you just think about it, there were 7,500 hotspots or places that did not have hand washing facilities. The National Business Compact in Kenya provided over 5,400 of those hand washing facilities, did a campaign that reached over 18 million people. And we raised over $6 million, but to be honest, that was very little in terms of what we could actually get from the creativity, the workforce, and the desire for people to really do. And we were supported by the government of Kenya.
It's an excellent example of how we can really move forward. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's an example of partnership. And a good example also, it goes very much on hand washing, but there are many other areas of, if I may interrupt, because otherwise we are running out of time, but I forgot to say something. I think today is your birthday. So happy birthday to you. We also saw your son.
Thank you.
Son on your back. So it's also a good family.
You should be singing happy birthday. You should have started with that, Roberto.
I was doubting whether I should sing, but I just let that for another moment. But thank you so much, Miriam.
Thank you.
We'll continue now the conversation. Last but not least, we have Scott also. This is also about partnership, but partnership also on vaccination. Again, with all the sensitiveness that this have, but I think that the initiative of Convince is worth also listening and to see how we can contribute. Scott, thank you again for joining. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And I want to thank all of you for the great comments thus far. And as the Director General mentioned at the beginning, this is multi-sectoral collaboration at its best. And I'm pleased and happy to be here today to talk about Convince, which is an activity that we've developed on a global scale in collaboration with a number of people around the world and institutions and business partners to Convince, which we've launched with the U.S. Council for International Business and have worked very closely with IOE and other partners. I want to thank already for that collaboration, because as Kate, the Director General, and others have said, we can't do this alone. We're all in this together. And what is the best way that we could get out or get back to a place where the world ought to be? So we came up with the term Convince, which is an acronym for COVID New Vaccine, Information, Communication, and Engagement. And business partners to Convince are working together of how we get the business community, organizations around the world that are the trustworthy organizations that are evidence and database to address the challenges that we have. And the best way that we thought to put this together in the amount of time that I have here is to mention that we put together a global COVID-19 workplace challenge. And looking at challenges in the past, what workplaces could do, it was clear that if we put this challenge out and companies sign on, and it's not just companies that are private sector, it's multi-sectoral companies. You could have governmental organizations, NGOs, all members of civil society that employ people, and the strong alliance that we have with IOE and the 159 organizations that have been mentioned, as well as the other parts of the U.S. Council for International Business Network, have driven us to a point where we think we can share this workplace challenge today, and hopefully many of you will think about signing on, as well as help us promote this around the world. And it's very simple. 6 messages. What can we do at the workplace? 1, listen to employees' needs and concerns about the impact and prevention of COVID-19. 2, follow the latest public health guidance to protect myself, my employees, my workplace, my customers, and my community from COVID-19. 3, promote vaccine literacy based on the latest scientific evidence of vaccination benefits and risks. 4, encourage vaccine confidence and uptake. 5, advocate for accessible, equitable, and timely vaccination of employees. And then finally, E, engage with communities, schools, faith-based organizations, and public health leaders to stop the spread of COVID-19. Through our COVID Convince group, business partners to Convince, we've generated these pieces that we think are the right common ground that we all can start on. That doesn't mean that we can't foster the opportunities for vaccination, both at the workplace and now the proverbial workplace that is quite different as we have the future of work has changed. We think that this COVID workplace challenge that all can sign up to. And we have info@businesspartnerstoconvince.com is how we're going to begin to promote this. We believe this movement will help us do what I think many people have said today is fundamental, how we have a proper communication that's not just on the right message, but also the right amount, the right dosage that they hear from their employer, the most trustworthy source, as cited earlier. They hear from their friends, their family, their religious leaders, and others and throughout civil society, and have this evidence-based, as Kate O'Brien mentioned so well, with the World Health Organization and others continuing to show the need for equity and addressing new variants or whatever else might be out there. I think the pieces that we've said here today are key, the preventive culture that we're all working together, but also the integral role of business. So Guy Ryder had some excellent points at the beginning. I think we're all aligned. We would like to say on any side of the world, I'm speaking from in the U.S. now with the U.S. Council for International Business Foundation and the Business Partners to Convince side. But we believe that we can help develop these tools together. We believe the innovation of industry and the private sector can do this well. And we look forward to more of this. We'll put the information both in the chat, and Roberto and your team at IOE in Geneva and around the world. We really appreciate the collaboration and look forward to opportunities to continue to advance, convince business partners to convince, and generally the powerful voice for businesses you have well established here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. So now we have the questions and answers part, which I think is important. There are a lot of questions, and it would be very difficult for me to sum up, and that's why Matthias is helping me, and also he's going to raise it to you. Some of them have already been answered, but Matthias, the floor is yours. Can you help us on the questions?
Thank you so much. And perhaps I just run through all the questions, and then you can see to what you actually relate. There were a lot of questions which relate to the distribution of vaccinations, right? And Guy, there's one question directly to you in how far the ILO can play a role in prioritizing certain sectors in specific countries, for instance. There are questions linked to the impact of the lockdown on mental health. And again, to you, Guy, a question, what role the ILO can play there, whether the ILO develops some guidance on mental health for the workers who are in lockdown. There were many questions linked to companies, which role companies can play when it comes to vaccination, how they can promote it on the one hand, and also whether there are practical experience of companies who have bought vaccinations themselves for their workforce. So if someone can respond to that. People shared Mtunsi's statement that we can and should not only focus on vaccination, that we need to look at all the preventative measures and to make sure that it is really about masks, it is about testing, and so on and so forth. There's a question whether vaccination can become mandatory for business travel or for travel generally. And that is, of course, something we see more and more also now in the news, that certain providers say they only take passengers if they are vaccinated. So this is a question, will that be more common? And also what would be the impact of that? There is a question linked to the impact of vaccination in view of all the different variants which are now popping up. And finally, there's a question linked to the timeline. When do we think and when do we want to achieve that 70% of the global population is vaccinated? Is there any idea when that will be taking place? So over to you, Roberto.
So it's a difficult question, I have to say. I will start with Guy, and thank you again, Guy, for remaining with us. We really appreciate, again, the effort you've made.
Thank you, Roberto. Probably I won't get the microphone again. So just to say what a great conversation this has been. It's been well worth listening to. I've learned a lot. Just to answer the 2 points that were directed in my direction. Yeah, I think we're seeing in national rollouts prioritization of certain demographics, age demographics, of course, for the reasons that Dr. O'Brien has said, but also from a world of work perspective, certain categories of worker, obviously, the health and care sector. And going beyond that, I think it is important, and we see our member states doing it, that other categories of worker are given priority. We've worked internationally so that maritime workers, for example, we talked a lot about the international dimensions of this crisis, are designated as key workers or essential workers. And you know, you can extend this, and I think one of the comments in the chat box reflected this. Probably the same categories will not apply in different national circumstances. There will be some categories of worker who are more essential or key in some places than in others. And sometimes these categories might be in places that you wouldn't initially intuitively think about. Supermarket cashiers, bus drivers. No, it really is quite a heterogeneous and context-specific concept. And lastly, and I'll be very quick on this, I think, if there's a mea culpa to be made here, I think it should be made. You know, we just simply have not done enough around mental health and psychosocial hazards and problems at work. It's almost like the invisible epidemic, and certainly interacted with my own staff here at the ILO. We know how tough this has been from that point of view, and those consequences are going to be with us for a long time. We already have on the ILO agenda the possibility of action in coming years on biological hazards that predated the pandemic. I think we ought to be looking also at how we can step up our work on mental health and psychosocial issues as well.
Thank you so much, Guy. Out of this also will provide also some inputs that can also be helpful also to get this conversation further. I don't know, there was a question of what can we do else at the company level. I don't know whether Stefan also you want to make any remark, and also will ask any of you, but perhaps Eric, the company people that we have here.
Thank you for the possibility. First of all, what we need is a bridge between the vaccine distributor and the companies, which usually are employers associations. And this is the path we are trying to get with our Ministry of Health, because otherwise there will be chaos. You need viable bridges. So that's the first recommendation. Use the employers organization as a bridge to the government. Otherwise you will fail, will get into chaos. And number two, referring to different national situation, you have to be aware about the conflict between prioritization and participation. Because if we have vaccine prioritization, it is not wiped out by company participation in the vaccine process. And you have to be aware companies who offer participation very often are expecting that they are they get earlier vaccines for their workforce. And this is a very conflictuous way of dealing. And if you participate, you have to be aware that the political prioritization cannot be wiped out by company participation. And last and final call, we are not supporting mandatory vaccination in our companies. We try to lead by example, but we have a rising numbers of members who are thinking that vaccination can be an entry card of participation in their services. For example, concerts, airlines, tourist arrangements. So there is something you have to evaluate. There will be a growing number of companies to say, if you want to participate in this or that, you have to show us a type of vaccine proof. And this is challenging because this might split societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your participation. I will give just quickly the floor to Jerick and perhaps to Sharon Tunsi. Tunsi, you have also to leave.
I fully agree with what Stefan just shared. Adding one point, our main concern is the medical secret. And I think we need to have a clear statement from the WHO, from the ILO also, that we should all as company respect the medical secret. We will have more and more people, thanks to the diversity, that will say no to the vaccine or yes to the vaccine. We are not able, and we should never disclose the medical secret. I think it's important that communication on that appear. The next point is what we mentioned about the COVAX. I think we should participate to this initiative, because what we see, it's that in our countries, each time there is a place where boats, vessel, lorry are coming, we increase the number of cases. So if we do not vaccinate other countries than ours, we will never finish with the outbreak.
Thank you, Jared. Ntunsi, Sharon?
No, Roberto, I think rather give Sharon me. Thank you very much. I'm rushing to cross over to another webinar. Thank you. Really thanks to all the panelists. I enjoyed the chat, and goodbye till we see each other soon. Guy and everybody in Geneva. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Sharon, this compulsory debate, you have been reflecting on that in ITUC or any other remarks?
Absolutely. And I think we all share the same view that maximizing vaccination is important, but you can't make it compulsory. If you do that, you open yourself to incredible challenges. I'm very impressed with the convinced strategy, and I hope the AFL-CIO and the unions are working with you, because it is trusted people. And many governments are showing the lead on this. I know, even Nigeria and other places in Africa are asking employers and trade union leaders to join a trusted group of people to actually work both in perception nationally, but also in the workplace, where unions and employers can work together to convince people this is important. But again, I state, vaccines alone are not going to be the answer in many places for some considerable time. So we need rapid antigen testing alongside of it. We need to make them to scale, to make it freely available for employers, for workers, indeed for public events, if we're to get business, particularly at the small to medium enterprise, back to work with the confidence of the community. I can't comment about the travel aviation piece, because I think it's really, again, going to be fraught with difficulty. On the one hand, we're all really happy, I'm sure, that if we're vaccinated, we can actually make decisions about what's appropriate for travel and what's appropriate use of technology. But I do think companies will open themselves up to legal challenges if discrimination becomes widespread. And so we're really going to have to look at safety as the key piece rather than just one measure. So I totally agree with the business voices there.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I would ask Scott and Miriam to forgive us, because we are now have to end this conversation, but we'll have to follow up. What we do can be serious is we'll have some action with you. I mean, we want not to do it alone. I want also to thank my president. He has been listening all the time, and I can tell you that it's not just a listening mood, also he's pushing for action from all of us to get things done. I mean, that's going to come. I want to thank you, Matthias. Matthias, apart from the deputy, he has been very, very helpful also to bring all these voices together. Thank you, Matthias. Monique, also, who is behind us, also arranging all the logistics together with Marina and other people in the staff. And of course, the interpreters who have been so patient, especially for those like me who talked quickly. So thank you so much. Again, let's keep connected, let's keep safe, and also committed to action. See you soon.